Our first speaker, and I have already, if you heard him this morning, thank him for stepping in at a very late notice, is Jonathan Metzl. He's Frederick Metzl Chair of Sociology and Medicine, Health and Society, and Director of the Center of Medicine, Health and Society at Vanderbilt University. His research interests explore the interactions between psychiatry, gender, race, and culture. And he's a nationally known expert on gender representations in antidepressant advertisement, the author of The Protest Psychosis, How Schizophrenia Became a Black Disease, and Prozac on the Couch, Prescribing Gender in the Era of Wonder Drugs. And he will speak to us today of Rethinking Diagnosis, Race, Stigma, and the Politics of Schizophrenia. Our second speaker, Katherine Hayles, professor of literature at Duke University, to whom we owe a great deal, more than, in fact, can be recounted. Particularly her book, How We Became Posthuman, is a standard reference in these discussions. Her upcoming publications are Making a Critique, a New Paradigm for the Humanities, which is what she will be speaking about today, and co-author with Jessica Pressman, How We Think, Digital Media and Contemporary Technogenesis. And our kind respondent, who is facing, like all respondents, an impossible task, our colleague Jesus Rodriguez-Velasco, who is professor and director of undergraduate studies at the Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures, and also a core faculty member in ICLS. He teaches medieval and early modern studies at Columbia. His most recent works is an article called Atomic Trinity and a piece called Plebejos Margines. So, Jonathan, you first, and then we'll proceed.
Thank you. Terrific. Well, thank you so much. It's such a great pleasure and honor to be here with such an esteemed panel and lineup of speakers. I think we were going to get the lights here. Perfect. Thank you. And so I just wanted to maybe just pick up very quickly on some of the issues that seem to come up in the first panel about the kind of utility of humanistic critique, which is something that the first speakers and Lydia was talking about in her comments as well. And I would say that, you know, from my own perspective and my own work, which I'll be talking about this morning, that I think that you know, one additional kind of defense of humanistic critique is that the very practice. This is great. That's great. Thanks. Oop, oh, there we go. All right, great. That's great. I'll serve popcorn. That one of the issues about the utility of the humanistic critique is that it also helps us, you know, to use some of the terminology that we just heard in the comments, crack the language or kind of form assemblages that uncover some of the political conundra that the methods of science very often raise, but often have a difficulty methodologically addressing. And the case study that I'll be talking about today, much more of a kind of case study than a kind of a bigger palette than we were hearing about before, is my work, my kind of ongoing work on race and schizophrenia, and the question of race and schizophrenia as being a kind of tension of, you know, this moment in which there are issues that arise between issues of violence and race and definitions of the illness itself that are very much at play in my own profession of psychiatry, and that are issues that people raise, but that in a way the methods of medicine in particular has a hard time addressing. Now, as you just heard a little bit about, I'm somebody who's trained both as a psychiatrist and as a humanities scholar, and I actually split my week at Vanderbilt, so I'm in the psychiatry department, a very biological neuroscientific psychiatry department. I'm there, you know, a day a week, roughly a day and a half. And if you come up to me and you ask me what is schizophrenia on a Monday or a half of a Tuesday, I will tell you that I'm somebody who's trained in the tradition of biological psychiatry, and so I will tell you that the illness of schizophrenia, of course, a long Deleuzian history, but I'm going to reference that, but not on a Monday or Tuesday. I'll tell you that instead that schizophrenia is an illness that has symptoms such as delusions, hallucinations, paranoia, social withdrawal, and these symptoms are caused by a variety of developmental, environmental co-founders, but underlying all of those things, at least in the theory of neuroscience, is some kind of biological substrate. Somehow there is some kind of aberration in a person's neurotransmitters and their brain matter in some aspect of schizophrenia that is underneath all of the kind of cultural reference, something that is itself biological. And if you're not biologically inclined, maybe just remember one number from this talk, which is that According to the tenets of genetic science, schizophrenia is an illness that should occur in 1% of the world's population, or 1 out of every 100 people. The prevalence, so-called prevalence of schizophrenia, should occur in roughly 1 out of every 100 people. And this is because beneath the level of culture or race or ethnicity, anything like that, that basically because of some deeper genetic process, that schizophrenia should occur at an equal distribution regardless of who people are, what kind of music they like, how they dress, where they live, because again there's an underlying genetic variable. Now I know that this is a talk about science, and I'll just tell you that that is the scientific portion of my talk today. I will also say now that if you ask me on a Tuesday afternoon, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or you can easily catch me on a Sunday. I'm very easy to catch on text or cell phone. I'm actually one of the problem children of this kind of multitasking we were just hearing about. And if you ask me on those days, I will tell you that I'm still somebody who believes in the project of psychiatry. I still believe that there is a real biological thing, a real illness. But I would also say that the material reality of what it means to have schizophrenia, at least in the United States, is complicated by a series of, we might call them cultural reference or stigmatizations or misperceptions. And the two key ones that I study most frequently, first is, you don't even have to worry about this text, the text on this slide. I'll just tell you that if you are an African American man in the United States, you can pretty much pitch that 1% number out the window that I just showed you, because you are 3, 4, 5, 6, even 7 times more likely to be overdiagnosed with schizophrenia and underdiagnosed with a series of related conditions, including delusions, including depression, attention deficit, other kinds of illnesses. And so in a way, here's one example where we see that the assumptions about science and actually the ways that science is maybe culturally enacted are in tension in relation to if you add race as a co-founder in the United States. The second and related, we might call it kind of really stigmatization or misperception, the one that's very much related to the first, is this assumption that people with schizophrenia not are only black, but they're also unduly hostile or violent. Now, this is not a surprise to anyone in the New York area, certainly who's watched the television program Law and Order, because if you watch that show and there are 5 minutes into the show, somebody has schizophrenia and that thing, you can pretty much go do your laundry, do your shopping, and come back at the very end, because the person with schizophrenia is always the killer in that particular show. There are very prevalent cultural stigmatizations of schizophrenia as a violent disorder. This is a study by Watson, Corrigan, and Adati from Psychiatric Services a couple of years ago, and this was a study of attitudes of police officers, and basically what they did in this research gave a series of vignettes to experienced police officers. And the first set of vignettes said something like, Bob and Sam get into a fight, Bob pushes Sam, you're called to the scene, what do you do? The second vignette was Bob and Sam get into a fight, Bob has schizophrenia, Bob pushes Sam, you're called to the scene, what do you do? And what they found was that in these two vignettes, simply adding the word schizophrenia to a vignette that wasn't anything like Bob puts a shotgun in your face or Bob runs down the street shooting up the town, what they called minimally intrusive violence. And even though everything in the two vignettes was the same, when they just added the word schizophrenia to the vignette, the police officer's perception that the perpetrator of this incident was violent went from about 15% to something like 69%, a strongly statistically significant shift, even though, again, everything else in the vignette was the same. And also, the officers were also just as likely to, more likely in the schizophrenia vignette to say this person should be arrested, they should be incarcerated, or something like that. Now, let me say that this is not something that's particular to the police. And in fact, here at Columbia, Link and Phelan, for example, have done extensive studies of American popular attitudes and have shown that actually the American mainstream is very likely to assume a kind of fear of schizophrenia. Now, let me tell you that I'm calling these things misperceptions for a couple of reasons. One, I can't be clear enough about this. There is no brain scan, blood test, PET scan, SPECT scan that you can do that tells you that some racial or ethnic group is any more likely than any other racial ethnic group to have schizophrenia. You can't look on a slide, you can't look on a scan and say, oh, this is this race or ethnicity and this is another race or ethnicity. So in a way, this is what I would say is entirely a cultural reference. And the other aspect is that in relation to the misperception of people with schizophrenia, schizophrenia as being violent. Actually, if you look at on-the-ground research about what's really happening in the real world, you can see that actually the opposite is in many ways the case. And I think the best study in this regard was a study done by John Brecky and Kathy Prindle at the USC School of Social Work, where they tracked actual police contacts in the Los Angeles area between 2000 and 2005. They looked at actual police reports over this 5 or 6 year period, something like 6 or 7 thousand police reports where somehow the word schizophrenia was mentioned in the police report. And what they found in this research was that if you were somehow diagnosed with schizophrenia or called schizophrenic, and you were involved in a crime, your chance was actually, you can see it up here, 65 to 130% more likely that you were going to have the shit beaten out of you by someone else rather than that you were going to be the perpetrator of the crime. And of course this makes sense when we think about it, because people with this illness are very often talking to themselves or delusional or socially withdrawn or something like that. But at least in this study, which was an expansive study in LA, you were much more likely, if you were diagnosed with schizophrenia, to be the victim of violence much more than you were to be the perpetrator of violence. And here again, we see that the assumption about how schizophrenia is was directly at odds with what was really happening in the real world. Now, I can say that you might think, oh, this should be something that's easy for psychiatry or medicine to fix. And we've tried things like training doctors in objective disease criteria. We've tried training in so-called cultural competency, which if I get through this in 33 minutes, I will be making fun of at the end of the talk. If not, just take my word for it. We've tried public information campaigns, and yet not only do these stigmatizations persist, they actually increase over time. And one example of this is, for example, in Lincoln Phelan's work here from Columbia, they found that misperceptions of people with schizophrenia was the most prevalent. They did work on basically looking at popular attitudes. How do you feel about mental illness? And they asked questions and looked at surveys from the 1950s on down. And the questions were like, would you want somebody with depression living next door to you? Would you let somebody with obsessive compulsive disorder be a private detective solving your crime? Would you want somebody like this, babysitting your children? And what they found was that Americans were dramatically more accepting of illnesses like depression and anxiety between 1950 and the present day. The one indicator that got worse between 1950 and now is, would you want to sit next to somebody with schizophrenia on a bus? Again, because of these fears of violence. And so this is where I jump in as somebody who's trained both in the methods of medicine and also in the humanities, in a way of kind of, again, to use this term, kind of cracking open some of the assumptions here. And what I argue in my research is that even though these seem like very presentist assumptions and very present stigmatizations, that in a way you have to understand these stigmatizations also as remnants of an ongoing transformation, at least in American society. I have some stuff to say about global, which I can maybe address in the Q&A. But there was a very particular transformation that happened in the United States. And I say that because if you look at cultural assumptions about schizophrenia in a host of cultural sites, you'll see that actually if you look in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, or 50s, Americans very broadly assumed that schizophrenia was an illness of docile white women. And all of a sudden in the 1960s, you see the emergence of a particular subject in medical journals and popular films, and that is the angry black male schizophrenic subject. And what I argue in my research is that there are many complicated reasons why that particular subject emerged in American culture, none of which really had to do with actual symptoms, and many had to do with both cultural anxieties about the civil rights era and also about the particular ways that we frame schizophrenia. And so what I do in my research is do a kind of three-level analysis. And one level is to look, again as an American studies scholar, at changing American cultural representations of schizophrenia. So I look at American films, at newspaper and magazines, and also at medical journals. The second part of my analysis is that I look at archived hospital charts from a particular hospital. And then the third part is that I use the methods of really the critical humanities to answer, I think, or at least address or try to change the language or the assumptions about the ways in which scientific and medical discourse understands not just schizophrenia, but more broadly questions of race and stigma. And so what I'd like to do with the remainder of my time is just give you a few examples of the kind of research I do. And let's first jump back to the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And I'll say that if I had gone up to you and said somebody with schizophrenia is violent, you would probably have no idea what I was talking about, because we really hosted a very different set of cultural assumptions about what schizophrenia is. This slide up here right above me is actually an article from the late 1920s from the New York Times. And you can see that one cultural assumption about schizophrenia in the 1920s and 1930s in particular was an assumption that the great white male novelists, poets, playwrights, creative figures of the time all had a kind of leg up on their non-mentally ill competition, because not only did they suffer from schizophrenia, they suffered from a particular symptom that gave them a leg up on the competition, and it was a symptom that's one of my favorite words now, called grandiloquence, a propensity toward flowery prose that helped them kind of put their words into these very kind of elevated, puffy, kind of flummery kind of language. Now you might be thinking, we do think about creativity and mental illness in association with each other now, but we think about it in terms of bipolar disorder. But it's important to note that bipolar disorder really even wasn't a diagnostic category at the time. It was a very small kind of manic depressive analytic category, but schizophrenia was an incredibly broad category that encapsulated, among other things, white male genius. Dementia praecox was an earlier term for schizophrenia, and you can see from this slide from the 1920s that it was assumed to be found in conditions found in the seclusive, sensitive person with few friends who's been the model of behavior in childhood. During the 1930s and 1940s, there were a host of articles in popular magazines like Collier's that basically invited white middle-class people to open their homes to people with schizophrenia who were all assumed to be white. So they said, invite them in as boarders, share a meal with them, let them babysit your children, all these assumptions that I really think you would have not exactly find in the present day. Schizophrenia literally means split mind, as many people here probably know. And there were also a lot of representations of schizophrenia in women's magazines like Ladies' Home Journal and Better Homes and Gardens. And the arguments here are that basically the modern American woman is being driven crazy by the pressures of modernity. And so this pressure of having to cook for your husband and be a good mother and do all this kind of stuff was driving American women crazy in record numbers. Now, people might know that probably the most popular and widely distributed assumption about that kind of argument was the 1948 Anatol Litvak film, The Snake Pit, starring Olivia de Havilland. Anybody here seen this particular film by any chance? Highly, highly recommended, based on a 1946 Mary Jane Ward autobiographical novel. For people who haven't seen this film, I'm just going to quickly ruin it for you. This was a movie about Olivia de Havilland, who was working as a writer. She'd had a very successful career, publishing some stories, and she was just doing totally fine on her own. Then she's working, and this guy starts showing up where she's working, and he starts asking her out, and she says, no, no, no. Then she makes this fateful mistake of saying, okay, fine, I'll go to lunch with you. Then she makes another mistake, which is saying, I'll go to dinner with you. And then she makes this almost fatal mistake, which is that she agrees to get married to this guy. They quickly go and get married. 3 days into the marriage, she has an outbreak of schizophrenia, which is manifest by, among her other symptoms, her inability to recognize her husband, which of course means that she is severely mentally ill. They cart her off to an asylum, and they do a host of barbaric treatments to her. They dunk her in a freezing cold bathtub. They spin her around. But certainly the most barbaric treatment is endless hours of psychoanalysis. I'm just kidding, my mom's a psychoanalyst. Where they force her again and again to talk about her family. They cart in the husband about every 20 minutes or so in the film, and they're like, who is this man? And she'll look up and she'll be like, dude, I have no idea, which means that she still has schizophrenia. After about 15 minutes to go in this film, she has this tremendous breakthrough, which I apologize for ruining this for you, but she realizes it's all about her father. She kind of warms up, opens up, they bring the husband back in. She says, darling, I love you, which shows that she's cured. And in the film's final scene, the couple kind of drives away from the asylum into the suburbs to reproduce, or whatever people did in the 1940s. Now, I am slightly making light of this film. I want to say that it was a very important film at the time. There weren't a lot of people making films about state hospitals or about schizophrenia. But I would also say that it replayed a very common visual iconography, which was this assumption of schizophrenia as being an illness of a certain kind of white middle-class womanhood. Here's an early advertisement from the American Journal of Psychiatry from 1951. And you can see that these early drugs are assumed to be kind of something that helps these women suture away their symptoms with the help of early psychiatric drugs. Now, let me be very clear. In no way am I saying that schizophrenia was an illness that only afflicted members of a category so-called white. In fact, there were so-called Southern Negro hospitals where schizophrenia was the only diagnosis given to everyone in the entire hospital. What I am saying is that you wouldn't know that if you looked at American cultural representation in the 1920s through early 1950s, where schizophrenia really was presented as an illness of the white mainstream in ways that encouraged identification with certain groups of people and rendered other groups of people as invisible. Now, let me jump forward to the 1960s and 1970s. And I can pretty much tell you that everything I've told you, you can just pretty much largely pitch it out the window, and that schizophrenia discourse in the United States all of a sudden comes to be dominated by the emergence of a particular character, and this is the angry black male schizophrenic subject. This occurs across a wide swath of American cultural representations. This is a film from 1963, a B-movie classic by Samuel Fuller called Shock Corridor. Anybody here seen this film? All right, bonus points. And this film got a lot of press for a lot of reasons, none the least of which was the infamous trapped on the nympho ward scene, which, trust me, is worth seeing the movie for. But I would also say that this is also a film about a psychiatric hospital, about a psychiatric ward. But in this film, it's a men's ward, and the character with schizophrenia is a character named Trent, played by an actor named Harry Rhodes, up there on your right. And the story in this film is basically that this was a person who had had a very successful childhood and early adulthood, a model student, an excellent citizen by all accounts. And then he started going to meetings inspired by the Reverend Martin Luther King. And then he started going to civil rights protests. And then he started thinking about desegregating a school. And all the pressure of trying to kind of assert civil rights or participate in these protests not only drives him to insanity, to which point he ends up in a mental hospital, but it also causes him to become violent. And in the film's key scene, he actually starts a race riot on the ward. And so, again, a very different set of assumptions. You also see this on the front pages of American newspapers, where all of a sudden in the 1960s you see FBI 10 most wanted lists that suddenly tell these stories of angry black men who are kind of on the loose across the United States. And another place you see this are in psychiatric journals. Now, it was very interesting for me in my research. If you look for race and schizophrenia together in the 1950s, you will hardly find any articles, at least in the American Journal of Psychiatry or Archives of General Psychiatry, that talk about the race of research subjects. There's just this assumption people with schizophrenia act this particular way. Very, very little mention of race. All of a sudden in the 1960s, you see the emergence of studies like this one, Delusions and Hallucinations in White and Negro Schizophrenics, that actually categorize research subjects according to race and diagnosis. And it was interesting for me because I kept wondering, why was this the case that race as a category shows up in the 1960s? And I think the most prevailing reason is that in the 1950s, before civil rights, hospital wards were segregated. And most of the research was happening on white-only wards. All of a sudden, the hospital wards become desegregated. And in the 1960s, you have different kinds of people on the wards, and the researchers were saying, well, that guy has schizophrenia, and that guy has schizophrenia, but they don't look exactly the same to me. And so all of a sudden, you see these comparison studies, and invariably what they would find was that the white form of schizophrenia was marked by cognitive decline, but the black form was kind of like he attacked his doctor, some kind of physical violence. Now, the question of why this transformation happened in really such a very short period of time is something that I talk about a lot in my research, and I have 4 kind of explanatory models. But given the time limits today, I'm just going to mention 3 of the models, and then maybe just say a bit more about the 4th. But I'll just say very briefly that one mechanism I talk about in my research is a conflation in American popular culture, again, thinking again about language, of this a conflation between between the kind of split mind of the illness and the symptoms that were assumed to arise in a racially split country. And my kind of evidence for this point is a kind of quantitative analysis I did in American popular media, looking at the emergence of a particular term, racial schizophrenia. Now, according to LexisNexis and ProQuest, this term was used only 4 times in all American media up till the year 1955, and then over 900 times over the next 10 years. disorders. And a lot of times they weren't talking about a particular body, but again about the country. Here's an article from the New York Times from 1966 talking about desegregation. And you can see right above me here it says, states, towns, and even individuals seem torn by a sort of racial schizophrenia in which Negro equality is simultaneously accepted and rejected. So again, this conflation of the split mind and the split country. A second mechanism that I'm not going to go into in detail today is that this is not just a top-down narrative. And in my book, for example, I talk about 16 or 17 of Martin Luther King's writings, where he's actually using the term schizophrenia to talk about the split that, in a kind of a Du Boisian sense, occurs in the black mind in living in a racist society. But for King, this is his unfulfilled dream speech, his last speech at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And he says there's a civil war going on, and what he means is there's a civil war going on in the black mind. There's a schizophrenia, as the psychologists or psychologists call it, going on within all of us. And what he means is that the split is an ethical choice between violence and nonviolence, and that he was arguing for, of course, the path of nonviolent resistance. Conversely, schizophrenia was also used as a protest trope in the writings of Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, Rat Brown, and other people. And here, the assumption, for people who know, for example, Greer and Cobb's book, Black Rage, was that schizophrenia was an illness, of course, but either the illness was the illness of white society that was causing people to go crazy, or black people were going crazy by living in a racist society. But in either case, in these arguments, the logical or ethical or sane choice was to fight back. The third mechanism was the appearance of particularly this kind of iconography, these kind of assumptions about black power, black liberation, black Muslims, in the rhetoric of psychiatric discourse itself. And in fact, the title of a lot of the work I've done, The Protest Psychosis, comes from a particular series of articles written in 1968 by two New York area psychiatrists, Bromberg and Simon, who were actually working on psych wards here in New York. And what they said was, well, we're working on these wards and we're actually seeing new kinds of patients with schizophrenia come in. These are all black men who have coming in having changed their names to African names. They come in with the physical sign of the clenched fist. And let me just read to you what they wrote in the Archives of General Psychiatry, probably the second most important psychiatric journal in the world at the time. They said, the particular symptomatology, I'm just over there on the side, the particular symptomatology we have observed for which the term protest psychosis is suggested is influenced by social pressures, the civil rights movement, dips into religious doctrine, the black Muslim group, is guided in content by African subcultural ideologies, and is colored by a denial of Caucasian values and hostility thereto. This protest psychosis is virtually a repudiation of white civilization. So for people who didn't catch that, they're either saying participating in civil rights is driving black men crazy, or that you've got to be crazy to participate in civil rights in the first place. But either way, it's not only causing a particular set of symptoms, it's also causing a particular projection of anger and hostility toward the values of white civilization. Now, I can't tell you how often that kind of logic shows up in the American Journal of Psychiatry, for example, in the 1960s. You see articles talking about African Americans who participated in sit-ins being driven crazy. There's one study by Raskin, Cook, and Herman from 1970 that basically said if you're black in the United States and you simply think your civil rights are being violated, that's a risk factor for schizophrenia. Now, these are the articles. I cannot emphasize enough how much there was an even more problematic set of representations happening in pharmaceutical advertisements in these same leading psychiatric journals. These are all from the American Journal of Psychiatry and Archives. And remember, before in the 1950s and 1960s, you saw these white women suturing away their symptoms. All of a sudden in the 1960s and 1970s, when the advent of these new major tranquilizing medications come out, all of a sudden you see advertisements that sell very powerful medications like stelazine, using iconography of kind of African tribal masks. Again, a very culturally Latin term. There was also a series of advertisements for Thorazine that, for anthropologists in the crowd, used some of the most racist language in the history of the English language, the so-called divide between the primitive and the civilized. And I would argue that the most problematic of these advertisements happened for the antipsychotic medication Haldol. And this series of advertisements ran in 1968, a series of advertisements in the Archives of General Psychiatry. Again, a highly influential psychiatric journal. Now you might be thinking, this person looks a lot like the godfather of soul, James Brown. And I would say that that's actually not an accident, because James Brown had an FBI file at the time where he was provisionally diagnosed as having schizophrenia. But what you can see here are several important things happening in this advertisement. This is somebody who, first of all, has the sign of the clenched fist. But unlike the Black Power Mexico City solidarity fist, this is an inverted Black Power fist, as if to say, I'm going to kind of punch you in the nose. This is also not something that's happening in a state hospital. Instead, this is an urban scene. You can see that it's almost hued orange behind. And of course, that would have been very important at the time, because this ad showed up 3 months after the Detroit riots and the Watts riots and series of kind of urban unrest. And the text really tells the true story, which is assaultive and belligerent, cooperation, social cooperation, clinical cooperation, either or both. In a way, psychiatry is presented as the authority for both a clinical problem and a social problem. Now, before I finish, I'll just tell you that there is a fourth mechanism, getting back to this question of language, and that is the question of the changing diagnosis itself. I would just say that it's interesting to look at what's happening to diagnostic terminology at this time. The first edition of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, came out in 1952. Now, for historians here, you know that the first edition was not actually called the DSM, but I'll just call it the DSM-1 for shorthand. And that was a term heavily influenced by psychoanalytic thinking. And so the definition of schizophrenia in the DSM-1 was called a schizophrenic reaction. It was a group of reactions that were kind of presented almost as a kind of mild Three Faces of Eve kind of personality split. All of a sudden in 1968, the DSM-2 comes out. This is the second version. And you see new language added to the DSM-2, and particularly terms like hostile and aggressive attitude and projection. And that text underneath is actually just taken verbatim. So you can see that they also use the universal male pronoun for the first time in the DSM-2. Now, I've actually done oral history interviews with people who worked on the DSM-2. And I'm like, what were you guys thinking, putting that language in 1968 into the diagnostic codes? But they, I think, rightly said, and it was very important. I mean, I talked to a lot of people that, you know, in a way we were using the science of the time, and we really were trying to be as decontextual as possible. But it's interesting to note, I'm doing a project with 2 of my graduate students at the University of Michigan, and we're looking at case studies in the American Journal of Psychiatry. And what we see is that this terminology, this particular terminology, we're comparing basically general articles about schizophrenia and articles that specifically talk about Negro subjects in the research articles. And you can see from this from these kind of graphs here that basically general articles are far less likely than what we're calling kind of Negro, I'm using the terminology of the time, articles, to talk about schizophrenia in very racialized terms. And what we're seeing is that schizophrenia becomes a way of talking about race under the guise of talking about mental illness in a very unconscious kind of way. Now, I'll just skip over the next part. I'll say that for people who know my work, I take these kind of cultural analyses, and I actually am working on an archive of a particular hospital, the Ionia State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, which was a hospital in Michigan. And I'll just say, to make a long story short, that the research that I do looks at the transformation of schizophrenia in this particular hospital as being an illness that in the 30s, 40s, and 50s was diagnosed in the hospital's largely white women population, and that over the course of the 60s and 70s, you see increasing numbers of African American, and that when the illness was shown as being a white illness, that there were all these assumptions that these women were artistic, so they would sell their arts and crafts, that they were harmless, and so Ionia's white women would kind of make this float every year for the Michigan State Fair Parade, and they'd kind of float down Main Street, Michigan, kind of waving to everybody. And it's kind of funny to think, like, in the present day, if we had a state fair float like in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, I wouldn't say that it would look exactly the same. All of a sudden in the 60s and 70s, you see increasing numbers of African American men, and particularly African American men from Detroit who had participated in black protests, come to the hospital. And when this happens, it's not so much they're making floats or asking people to do arts and crafts. Instead, they fear that these people might run away. And they start building more moats, more barbed wire around the hospital, and you probably know where the story's going, which is that in 1977, the hospital that I'm studying becomes actually overnight taken over by the correctional system. The population at that time is 70% African American, and all of a sudden, the Ionia State Hospital becomes the Riverside Correctional Facility, a medium security prison for all male offenders, and again, a facility that's largely African American. Now, I'll just say in conclusion, because I'm just about out of time here, that it's very interesting for me when I did my research into this facility that I went up to the prison, it's still standing, and I got a bunch of tours when I was writing my book, and I said basically, you know, I went up there thinking, well, this place has been a prison since 1977. It's going to be entirely different. It's going to be like a totally new facility. And after I went in the first time, and for people who have visited prison, they wand the bejesus out of you. They do every kind of pat down imaginable. But when they opened the door to the facility, it was this incredible moment because everything looked exactly like I was stepping back in time. It was like all the buildings were still standing. And when they were taking me around, I kept saying, that's the men's ward. That's the receiving hospital. That's where they did ECT. But these guards who were showing me around were saying, this place used to be a prison? It used to be a hospital? What are you talking about? They had no idea. And in fact, toward the end, the guards were emailing me saying, can you send us some pictures so we can show our wives? Because we can't believe this place used to be a hospital. And this kind of metaphor of this facility that stands in ways that are very historically predictable, but that there was this complete amnesia about the way, how things got to be the way they were. Okay, back there. How things got to be the way they were became, in a way, a kind of metaphor for me for what are some of the larger conclusions of my project, in which I argue basically that we're surrounded by these heavily racialized, heavily historical stigmatizations, and two that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk were assumptions about the race and violence of schizophrenia. And if we only try presentist types of interventions by saying we're going to change your attitudes now without knowing anything about the historical origins, then in a way we're doomed to see what we do see in this literature, which is that these stereotypes keep repeating themselves. And so in a way what I argue is that in a way, for example, if we're intervening into psychiatric stigma, it's not enough just to say mental illness is real, it's chemical, we have all these much more science now than we did. Of course those things are also true, but if you're just looking at the history of, or just looking at assumptions about mental illness and not looking at the ways in which stigma itself is not only historical but intersectional, that negative opinions about mental illness intersect with a whole host of other forces, notably racism and assumptions about race, then in a way you're only addressing half of the issue. And that's why I argue for understanding stigma as a discourse of really linguistic and rhetorical remnants. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
I'm very honored to be participating in this series of talks today and to be preceded by such wonderful papers as Rosie's, Srinivas's, and now Jonathan's fascinating work. I'd like to begin by noting something that went unmarked in the first panel, and that is the reliance of the humanities on discursive methods. Jonathan's work is different than that, but he's coming mostly from the social sciences. The second thing I'd like to remark before starting my talk is something that Rosie mentioned, the coevolution of technical objects and humans, which, if we take seriously, I think ought to have some implications for the way that we practice our craft in the humanities. So my talk is entitled Making Critique, and it has a kind of pun in it. that you can read across the comma, making critique, which is what we saw exemplified for us in the first panel. But you can put a caesura in there and read it as making and critique, and it'll be that latter interpretation that's the focus of my talk. As traditional print-based humanities move into the digital era, many strategies are emerging to support and retrofit academic departments. Some universities have established freestanding centers for digital humanities, including the University of Maryland, Virginia, Nebraska, among others. Others are hiring one or more faculty members in the area of digital humanities and incorporating them into existing departments and curricula. Some are fiercely resisting change and remaining resolutely in the print era. Whatever the case, very few have attempted to rethink categories, courses, and faculty hiring in ways that take more than a superficial account of the digital humanities and their implications for disciplines that have been operating upon a print-based model of scholarship. I suggest that the present media upheavals present a precious opportunity for doing so in the form of comparative media studies. This approach recognizes that print itself is a medium, an obvious fact that tends to be obscured by its long dominance within Western culture. As the era of print is passing, it is possible once again to see print in a comparative context with other textual media, including the scroll, the manuscript codex, the early print codex, the variations of book forms produced as changes in technology moved from letterpress to digital publishing machines, and born digital forms such as electronic literature and computer games, all of which can be published on a variety of different print and electronic formats. The subset of comparative media studies particularly suited to text-based disciplines such as literature is comparative textual media, which I'll just shorten to CTM, and it's to this paradigm I now turn. Just as comparative literature compares and contrasts different national literary traditions and languages in order to reveal deep-seated cultural assumptions and presuppositions, so does CTM seek to understand media in their historical and technical specificities in themselves and through comparative analysis with other media forms. In a sense, of course, this approach is nothing new. The long tradition of textual studies, bibliographic studies, and media-specific criticism points to this fact. Drawing on this work that emphasizes the materiality of print media, CTM enlarges the purview beyond print to a wide variety of different media forms while continuing to have a strong emphasis on the materiality of media. What is new in this approach is thinking of CTM not as a respected niche within a broader landscape of cultural and historical studies, but as a paradigm for rethinking disciplinary categories, curricula, pedagogical strategies, and hiring and credentialing practices. For example, it recognizes that the traditional period or genre-specific categories that typically structure English departments, such as 19th century novel or modernist poetry, have become unsustainable in a transatlantic globalized society. And I figured Harvard is an august enough institution, it wouldn't mind me using it as an example, but it's typical. You can see they call this the common ground, these categories. These classification systems no longer accurately reflect the scholarship and teaching of contemporary academia. Whatever their initial usefulness at the beginning of the 20th century, these classifications have ceased to be able to catalyze and initiate critical inquiries. Rather, they function more like fossils, witnessing to a bygone era. By contrast, CTM privileges media as important factors in determining the shape, significance, and dissemination of creative and cultural work, including literature. CTM pursues media as objects of study and as methods of study. focusing on the specificities of the technologies as well as the cultural ecologies they support, enable, and illuminate. A focus on media promotes awareness that national linguistic and genre categories are always already embedded in particular material and technological practices that have broad cultural and social implications. Thus, CTM offers a way of accounting for existing categories by making them productive within new contexts. Many humanities departments are now facing internal splits that divide along print-digital lines, with some scholars fiercely resisting the digital because of the threat they see it posing to their hard-won print skills and scholarly paradigms. So in other words, they're afraid that everything they've spent years acquiring is going to be rendered obsolete by the digital. This reaction is entirely understandable. It is also unnecessary. A CTM framework does not render print-based skills obsolete. On the contrary, they form an essential component of critical and pedagogical practices. Rather than implicitly assuming that these print-based practices are trans-historical and universal, however, the CTM approach emphasizes their historical and technological specificity. Further, print is itself not a universal or a monolithic term, but a word that designates many different kinds of media formats and literary practices. CTM takes as given that relationships between media forms are complex and commingled. Many bibliographic scholars have made this clear by pointing out, for example, the continuance of manuscript traditions long after the advent of print, influencing the development of print while at the same time being influenced by it. Similar complex relationships are developing now. Print is no longer the default medium of communication, as it has been arguably for the last 400 years, but print practices remain vitally important in exerting cultural and artistic influence, including in contemporary contexts where its vibrant and robust interplay with digital media influences the development of digital texts, even as it is also influenced by them. Indeed, so intermixed are digital and print media through modern print and publishing machines that they must be considered comparatively to make sense of their production at all. Recognizing this situation can and should inform critical practices and pursuits. It also has important implications for pedagogical practices and curricular design. As many have noted, the culture of, and Srinivas, Rosie both alluded to this, Bruno Latour's article suggesting that critique has run out of steam. There are many reasons for this, including the cultural and science wars, the economic downturn that has resulted in the disestablishment of many interdisciplinary programs, and the low esteem in which the humanities are held by the general public. A more important reason may be that critique has ceased to operate as a fruitful method for many scholars and for most beyond the academy. It often yields results that are apt to seem more formulaic than insightful, and it speaks to an isolated audience. The complexities of these factors notwithstanding, there's also a fundamental problem with the culture of critique. By its nature, it tends to be critical rather than constructive in tone, and Rosie mentioned this in her talk as well. As someone once said, only partly tongue-in-cheek, it amounts to saying to others, "Give me your best ideas, and I'll tell you what's wrong with them." Something that has struck colleagues in the sciences and social sciences as not a very good bargain. Rita Felsky puts it another way. She chastises literary critics for separating their object of study from the social world in which it lives by highlighting literature's uniqueness in ways that, quote, overlook the equally salient realities of its interconnectedness, the specific ways in which they infiltrate and inform our lives. One way to analyze literature that emphasizes its connections to the real world and to other fields of intellectual inquiry is through a focus on media. I suggest that CTM promotes a paradigm shift, a move that supplements the culture of critique with what might be called the ethic of making. Media are necessarily associated with specific technologies and material structures, as well as economic, legal, and social institutions. Although these can certainly be described and analyzed discursively, conceptual understandings are deepened and enriched by practices of production, a conjunction that puts critique into dynamic interplay with productive knowledge. This is self-evidently the case with digital media, where the practices of making digital objects are deeply interwoven with theorizing about them. But it's also the case for other media as well. Working with a letterpress printing machine, for example, gives one a richer and a more resonant context for work with print codices than would otherwise be the case, for example, as Johanna Drucker's work has shown. Pedagogically, CTM encourages practice-based research as part of the context of understanding, alongside and deeply integrated with theoretical and critical methodologies. This kind of gritty, hands-on approach can reveal nuances and contexts that have the capacity to illuminate in a flash of insight why a cultural object is formed the way it is and what its formation has to do with its textual and historical significance. So there are a bunch of people doing this kind of work. William Johnson on book rolls, Scott McCloud on comics, Chris Funkhauser on what he calls archaic digital poetry, and so forth. Moreover, an ethic of making shifts the emphasis from deconstructing existing ideologies and practices to constructing new kinds of practices. Both are undoubtedly necessary, but the culture of critique by itself is only half the picture. CTM explores the possibilities for cultural, social, economic, and theoretical transformation, not only by tearing down, but also by building up, thereby opening new horizons of understanding and alternative practices. And then I'll just conclude this written part of my presentation by noting that CTM has the advantage of being able to be implemented at different scales, a single course. There are many of these being offered at universities across the country as a course cluster, as a certificate program, or at its most transformative as a basis for an entire major. So now let me turn from this sort of exposition of the possibilities to where the rubber really hits the road in the humanities classroom, to give you some examples of how this approach would actually look in practice. So I'll begin with the work of Carolyn Brusilius, an art historian and my colleague at Duke University. Carolyn teaches a course on the medieval cathedral, and she used to make that entirely a lecture course. And then Duke made available software that allowed faculty easily to put their lectures online. So Carolyn took advantage of that, and she turned her classroom into a studio space. So students worked in teams of 3. One member of each team would be responsible for learning the CAD software that enables one to do these kinds of drawings. Second team member would be responsible for researching the resources of the region in which their fictional cathedral would be located. And the third member of the team was responsible for creating the narratives that every medieval cathedral needed in order to publicize its specific and unique characteristics. So the students would work during class time on their portfolios, this project of creating a fictional cathedral. Carolyn would circulate among the different teams during the class hour. The students could consult her lectures online for the historical background of actual cathedrals. And then at the end of the term, Carolyn called in a panel of scholars, and they served as judges while each team presented its fictional cathedral. And then the judges made their determinations for prizes, which were awarded at a subsequent celebratory occasion by the dean. So the students were simply on fire with this kind of methodology, and they began learning about the cathedrals inside out. For example, one of the requirements was making a budget for the cathedral, and there's nothing like making a budget to bring you down to earth. So they had to decide how much would the stonemasons be paid, how much would the carpenters be paid, where were they going to get the money for this, what big wealthy nobleman could they hit up in the area, and how would the narratives appeal to that nobleman, and so forth. So my second example is a course that I taught with Anne Goretta, who is a founding member of the French Oulipo, the workshop for potential literature dedicated to the idea of writing literary texts under constraints. And the title for the course was Machine Literature. So what that means in the case of the Oulipo is that the writers would construct elaborate algorithms based on a series of elaborate constraints. And one of the literary texts we looked at in that seminar was Georges Perec, Life, a User's Manual, which has an incredibly elaborate series of constraints on how he can draw from his database of elements and then incorporate them into the narratives of the particular chapters. So my objective, one of my objectives for this seminar was to introduce humanities literary studies students to the idea that technical objects could function as what Susan Blackmore called teams. That is, technical objects which embody ideas and transfer these ideas genealogically through a succession of technical innovations. Now, if you were to say this to a cultural anthropologist or a historian of technology, they would say, duh, what else is new? But for students in literature, this idea was not only new, it was shocking. So they are deeply versed in tracing intellectual genealogies, constructing the relationships between Hegel and Heidegger and so on and so forth. But their idea that these ideas could be embodied in technical objects which carry the ideas forward and also create certain problems that then have to be solved by the successive generation was a relatively new idea to them. So I started bringing in what I called teaching kits, drawing artifacts from the amazing Gessler collection of Things That Think. One of the first objects I brought in was this stack of Jacquard cards, and you see there on the other side of the screen the little dress label that this huge stack of cards was programmed to create. So there are a number of things to be learned from these objects. Number one is when the symbolic structure is embedded in a very cumbersome material substrate, you have to have a lot of mass to get a relatively small body of information conveyed. And then another point here is the way that ideas travel across media. So this is a delightfully self-reflexive silk portrait. So the Jacquard factories, sometimes as specialties, use silk weaving rather than wool or cotton to create these very fine-grained portraits, and this is a silk weaving from a Jacquard factory depicting the owners of Jacquard factories presenting a portrait of Jacquard, itself a silk weaving, to a group, to a local nobleman. But it travels further. This is a stereoscopic image used for the stereoscope that was popular towards the end of the 19th century of a Jacquard factory now in stereoscopic view. And once you see those Jacquard cards, then it's only a small leap to the Keyhole Cards. You see there a deck of cards with a series of holes along the sides. If you keep the cards deck intact and you put like a knitting needle through a hole, then the knitting needle acts as a selection instrument, and all the clubs, for example, drop out of the card. Then you can take the cards again, stack them up, put a knitting needle through, and the king of clubs falls out and so forth. So what you begin to see here is a migration of the idea of wholes as a manufacturing medium to the idea of wholes as a conveyor of information separated from the manufacturing artifact. And that leads to the card that you see there, which is actually used to identify plants through the same kind of selective putting a knitting needle through a series of holes until you're left with a card that has the characteristics of the plant that you want to identify. And from these cards, it's a very natural transformation to go to the Hollerith card. But as soon as you get to the Hollerith card, one of the things that you've done now is to separate the instructions from the data, an innovation that Babbage claimed for his analytical engine, but there are some Jacquard cards in the Gessler collection that show one set of cards being used to control the other set of cards. So Babbage perhaps was claiming more than he was entitled to. But now you get the problem of how you're going to store this information when you move from the very cumbersome substrate of the cardboard cards for Jacquard. And there you see core memory. So core memory is a early way to store information. It was threaded by hand, a series of thin wires with beads at each intersection, sending the current one direction through a wire created an upward polarity, the other direction created a downward polarity. This functioned as a binary information system. The problems with this are obvious. Not only does it require many tedious hours to manufacture with tiny, agile fingers, but if any thread in this block is broken, the entire block is useless and has to be thrown away. So then you get such things as the mercury delay line, where you have a piezoelectric element sending a sound signal through mercury. It goes around in a circuit. It's renewed when it gets to the piezoelectric element again, and another way to store information through acoustically inflected liquid flows. And then we go from there to rope memory. This is the Wang calculator. Mr. Wang was convinced that transistors were a fly-by-night technology. He chose to stay with rope technology. So there's an example of rope memory there on the inside of the calculator. Fairly cumbersome way to store information, a technological and business disaster, but ironically these calculators, for precisely that reason, have now become prize collector items. So all of these were ways to try to convey to the students that there are these technological genealogies, that ideas mutate through problems confronted and solved by introducing modifications in the technologies, and the idea that no idea is ever really new. It builds on previous technologies by introducing a series of innovations and differences that anthropologists call seriation. So now I move to my final example, and this for me is a very personal example. Like thousands or millions of others in the U.S., I was affected by the 2008 financial crisis, and in a matter of a few weeks saw roughly a third of my lifetime savings melt away. For me, that was a huge wake-up call that I was immersed in finance capital. I had no way out of it, and instituted a real compulsion on my part to understand better the system in which I was enmeshed and try to understand the roots and the causes and the consequences of the 2008 financial crisis. So I did what academics always do in the case of personal catastrophe such as this, convened a reading group. And so our reading group spent the fall semester reading documents about the causes of the financial crisis in 2008, But we soon discovered we couldn't stop there, that led to questions about credit and debit, so we kept going backward in time with books like 5,000 Years of Debt. That led to questions about what money was in the first place, which led us to obsolete paper money and the struggle of the Continental Congress during the Revolutionary period to force its populace to accept its own currency, and so on and so forth. It kept spreading outward and outward. So the semester is over, and had this been a conventional course, we would have done the conventional thing. We would have had everybody write a paper. They would have invested a lot of time and thought in those papers. Next semester starts, the papers are forgotten. Actually, absolutely nothing has changed except in the minds of a few people. But thinking about this merger between making and critique, our next step was to imagine how we might take some of what we had learned during that semester and convey it effectively to a much larger audience, including people who may not even know that they can be or should be interested in finance capital. So to that end, we decided to create an alternate reality game called Speculation. The idea of alternate reality games is that they play across multiple platforms, virtual, online, and real-world sites. To some extent, they use the real world as scaffolding for their game premise, and therefore you don't have to create all the digital assets from start. You can use the real world as its own best platform. So our story, our game, Speculation, has a backstory which goes like this. A few years in the future, the euro collapses, the Eurozone collapses with it, and we were hoping that history wouldn't overtake us in the course of making the game, because it had, for our purposes, to be set in the future. And a coalition of wealthy investment banks and powerful corporations has offered to bail the world out, but at the expense of seizing control of global economic systems. So democratic institutions still exist, but now they have to dance to the tune of this coalition, which we called, not very imaginatively, Metacorp. But in this future time, a resistance group has arisen. And Metacorp, among other things, has done away with the internet. All that exists now are a system of consumer apps. And so people in that future have no information about the 2008 crisis. So they're desperately trying to contact people in our present to gather information about the 2008 crisis and forward it to them via information entanglement through quantum entanglement. So quantum entanglement allows information to be passed back and forth, but not physical objects between this near future and our present. And at the same time, they're sending back documents about that future to our present to give their recruits information about what their future is like. And it's a dystopic future. So this is the backstory for the game, but players won't get it in that form. Instead, we're creating various rabbit holes. For example, a Facebook page which has a coded puzzle on it, and when you decode the puzzle, you get a phone number. And when you call the phone number, you get a kind of scratchy voicemail message which says something like, "I can't tell you too much now, it's dangerous, but we really, really need people to recruit and help us in our cause, but you have to prove your intelligence and your dedication by solving a series of puzzles." And then we're off and running. So these are the purposes of the game: to increase financial literacy, to explore the implications of our present course if we don't make changes, and then this last purpose, which I actually had to wrestle with myself to write on the screen like this for you to see, which is attack the culture of greed. And as a sophisticated intellectual, I thought, oh, that's way too naive and simplistic. And then I thought, no, if I can't say this, then there's really no purpose in the game. So it's kind of like Rosie saying, we can indulge in melancholy if we want, but what if we actually want to change things? How are we going to do that? And so I wrote the words, attack the culture of greed. So because we have multiple collaborators working on this game, we decided to modularize it. Each module is based on some aspect important to the 2008 crisis. And that strange neologism there at the bottom, plutonomy, comes from a series of memos that were leaked from Citicorp financial analysts. And this is the basis for the 1%. So the series of 3 memos, in fact, were arguing that the 1% is driving the economy, and they had a bunch of strategies you could use if you wanted to capitalize on that. That's their plutonomy. But the interesting part for our purposes is all the analysis they did to show that the 1% is controlling a hugely disproportionate segment of the economy. So this module will be one of our real-world components. These memos, when people put them up on the web, Citigroup would send a cease and desist order and they would have to take them down, but you know how it is with the web. If it ever gets on the web, it pops up again and again and again. These are loaded onto a USB stick that is cemented into a brick wall at 3 physical locations, and someone has to go and get your computer into the right position and download these files onto your computer, and then you put them up at the player discussion board. So gameplay proceeds modularly. We have 6 modules and 2 anomalous ones. One is the plutonomy. Each module has 5 levels. So the players enter by getting an interview with the founder of the resistance movement, who's now been captured, called Nex. And then you go into gameplay. You play through the 6 different levels of each of the modules. Then you get another interview segment and so forth. So the idea of the interview segments is to have a narrative driver for people who are into narrative. The idea of the gameplay is to have puzzles for people who are into games. And then because we have to offer our players some good, silly fun, this is one of the games we've invented for the Mindware module, which is a little headset that you put on that detects your brain waves. And with the software that comes, you get a little fireworks thing. You have to concentrate to get them higher and higher, and then when you blink, the fireworks explode. So our modification of that is an Angry Birds module, where you get the catapult put back further and further by concentrating, and then you blink, and it ejects an angry bird toward a wall of investment banks, and they swell up and then they explode, which we think might be psychologically gratifying. So I'll conclude by playing for you the 30-second teaser that we created to gather some attention to the game. Oops, sorry. Thank you.
I am going to be very short myself because, in any case, I think it is better that you all ask questions to both our presenters. But I just wanted to mention that we have music.
Yes.
Isn't that wonderful? No, it's fine. It's perfect. So I just wanted to point out that we had two different 1% in these two speeches. One of them is the 1% of the schizophrenia. The other one is the 1% of the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules, which also is linked to Marxian dictum that was before pointed out by Lydia. And I'm going to shorten up a little bit what I was trying to say, but I only wanted to make a couple of questions to our presenters. The first question is perhaps to Jonathan, which is something that he says in his book. He's talking about something that is very interesting, I think, for the study of the humanities, which is what I would call the culture of diagnosis. Is the fact that diagnosis is, as a matter of fact, some sort of narrative that puts together a database and a way to talk about the information contained in that database. I was wondering, while I was reading his work and while I was trying to listening to him today, I was also concerned about the circumstances in which he was doing his research, and the particular problem that some of the archives he was working with are, in particular, the Ionia Medical Hospital, right, psychiatric hospital. These archives have been destroyed or have disappeared, and I was wondering whether this sort of disappearance of the archives, which is something that plagues the study of the humanities and the study of history, etc., we can only work with a very limited amount of information. How did these archives got lost, and how they became destroyed? Who destroyed them? What is the purpose of this destruction? And in particular, whether there was some sort of becoming aware of that the diagnosis had actually been misdiagnosis, and that there was some sort of intervention in these archives. Because this is something that perhaps we also need to take into account when we study the problems the historical problems we study, and in particular those related to the biopouvoir that are so present in your research. And I also was thinking that there is something that is interesting in this diagnosis, is that how the language of the diagnosis, or how the language of this narrative that is in principle is a language for doctors, for psychiatrists, for scholars, how this language become also part of the common language, of the common uses of speaking, because I think that there is a gap between in this link, in how this language becomes more popular or more common, and how in a certain way we can talk about some sort of méconnaissance, this idea of Bourdieu, that when there is this transmission from the professional field, from the professional language to the common use of language, then there is also some sort of diglossia, or of the possibility that actually the non-professionals or the lay persons actually are submitted to some sort of misunderstanding of what's going on with this medical transactions. And my second question is for Kate, and I was wondering, I was observing that most scholars working on electronic and the digital culture take as a ground of comparison the printed culture and the printing press, and in a certain sense, I was wondering if this sort of comparison is also a little bit is sometimes a little bit partial, and I was wondering whether the actual choice of print culture as such grounds for comparison is a matter of closeness, because printed culture seems to be chronologically closer to digital culture. But I was wondering also if this studies or this scholarship in digital culture has a different sort of objective, is to elaborate a critique of the book as the support of culture. And it's interesting because even digital culture cannot, in a way, cannot make do without this metaphor of the book. Even the electronic publications, they call themselves books. So, so this is what I wanted to ask, whether the actual critique of this scholarship in digital culture is the printed culture, or is the book itself as a support of culture. And that's, I decided to shorten up a little bit. That's all.
Would you like to respond to this first and then take a set of questions?
Sure.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, I'll just say a couple of things. Thank you. Those were fantastic questions. And I'm excited to talk about maybe some of the resonances between these two very, very different talks. But one is actually about the process of record keeping and the charts themselves. I didn't really talk about it that much, but I was working on an archive for this Ionia hospital that was housed in the State Archive of Michigan. And it took me like 3 or 4 years even to find an archive of a state hospital, because most of the archived records had themselves been destroyed. The true reading is probably because people didn't really want to see what was happening in a lot of the asylums, but also there was just kind of the neglect narrative of a lot of the hospitals where they quite literally went condo. They became very high demand real estate and stuff like that. And so it was pretty much impossible to find an archive. And when I did find the archive, it was kind of like the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, the very end of the first movie, which is like I came to this thing and it was just like they were just all stuck in a bunch of boxes. Like these people's lives were just totally entombed in these random cardboard boxes that the archivist told me he had really fought to keep, but after the book and stuff like that, just because of space reasons and they didn't want to digitize a bunch of things and stuff like that, are destroyed. Now, if anybody's interested, I kind of illegally Xeroxed most of the stuff, so it does live on somewhere. But I would say that there were, I guess, 3 lessons or points that I would make about what you're saying. And one was just for me this question of what was powerful about holding that was about this tension between a particular kind of artifact, which was a different kind of hospital chart than the one that I'm used to using or holding, versus the kind of medical charts today. And what I mean is that when they would bring out the charts for me, I would request a batch of charts and they would just wheel them out. And every one of the charts was like, a phone book, or what we used to call a phone book, which was this big book where people's phone numbers were. And what was interesting was the kind of things that people would chart. Now, this was certainly a different level of surveillance, and I don't want to idealize that, but I would say that in the medical charts that I was looking at, there were things like all the epistolary correspondences between the doctors and the patients, holiday cards, pictures, all these kind of things, and even looking at the doctors' like histories of what they would take from the patients. You saw all this stuff where it was a very complicated, full developmental history. They would go out in the community and talk to the teachers, the neighbors, all these kind of things. And so in a way, it was a very different way than medical charts today, which are much, much more formulaic. They're much shorter. They're all electronic in a way. And I would just say that when I got, I mean, in a way, I kept thinking about historians of 50 or 100 years ago. They're going to have to go back through everybody's email and stuff like that to tell these kind of stories. But it was more like I just got a sense of a holistic person in reading these charts, which was very different from the ways in which, of course, the language becomes much more routinized because of liability issues and all these kind of things. So one was just about the physicality of the charts themselves and the type of materials that were embedded in those charts. The second was, because this is the era before electronic medical records, that I could see the actual revisions on the page. And so there was this big typing pool, for example, and people would, literally the doctors would dictate and the typists would type. But when every new version of the DSM came out, it was interesting to see that the diagnoses would change, but they wouldn't redo everybody's charts. They'd just go slash through the old diagnosis and put in the new diagnosis. And so when the DSM-2 came out, for example, a lot of the women who were in the hospital were initially diagnosed with schizophrenia. When the DSM-2 came out, I've got pictures in the book, and I'm doing another project about it now, where quite literally they would go slash, slash, slash through the diagnosis and just re-diagnose these women with melancholic depression, and that led to their leaving the hospital. Whereas a lot of the men were re-diagnosed per new DSM. A lot of them had been personality disorder or something, re-diagnosed. So I actually got to see this process happening on the page of what was happening with the diagnosis. And then I guess just the third quick point is that you talked about this question of, transmission, as if there's some kind of downward flow of these terminologies or these assumptions are invented in medicine and then are transmitted down into culture. And part of what I try to do in my research or in the stuff I write is to trouble that a little bit by saying that actually I try to write history, particularly the history of medicine, going the opposite direction, and say that actually you can presage a lot of problems with medicine in the cultural domain well before they happen at the diagnostic level. And one, for example, were these assumptions about race and schizophrenia. The language that was adopted in the DSM-2 appeared in popular culture 6 or 7 years earlier and then was reflected in the DSM-2. So it wasn't like the DSM-2 invented it.
Well, thank you for your question about the book as the ground for comparison. And I absolutely agree with that. In a way, it's not surprising. It's like when people first began trying to imagine cars, their first thought was to imagine a buggy without horses, and then gradually they realized, well, you might need a windshield. Well, you could do away with a lot of the buggy hinges and so on and so forth. So the same thing is happening now, I think, as we try to find our way into what digital scholarship and publishing would be like. The book presents itself as the preeminent model, and from there we're trying to think about what can be jettisoned if you're publishing in a digital format, what needs to be rethought, and so forth. And I think those kinds of revisions are still in a relatively early stage where the influence of the book is still very strong. I don't think that's going to be the case for digital scholarship, say, 10 years from now. But there's something else that's happening where books are incorporating digital technologies in themselves, or things associated with digital technologies, for example, like databases, or conceiving of the book as a central object in a distributed literary system that has components on the web, components in the real world, and so forth. And the result of this, I think, has been a kind of burst of exuberant creativity on the part of print authors, where they begin to see the digital not as their antagonist, but as their partner in rethinking what the codex book can be. And that, I think, is very exciting, and it's tied in with the whole explosion of book art in the contemporary period, where just the idea of the book is being thought, rethought, re-envisioned, reimagined in all kinds of ways while still preserving the codex form. So what a book is an object now of intense interrogation and creativity.
Great, thanks. We'll just take maybe 3 questions. No, go ahead. You're first.
One word I haven't heard here that I would hear. One word I haven't heard here that I would hear constantly 30 years ago in this kind of discussion is the term hypertext, which is saying where the book was going to go. That you would be able to take electronically terms in the book and follow them through, get more detail on their meaning, examples, and so forth, or even pictures, even videos and simulations of the volcanoes exploding. And the inventor of that was Ted Nelson, and I went to a talk of his where he demonstrated this on the screen. But he was operating in a world, this was 1974, before you had the internet, before you had personal computers. And so all those materials were going to be sitting in the basement or sitting on your desk. It's only what you had and what you might present in a learning situation or an exploring situation of a particular material. What happened that's amazing and healthy is the development of the internet, which takes you out to various places so that those things that the hypertext could connect to through links could be anywhere in the world, and a piece here and a piece there and another piece there. Including references to different books and to images of pages from the books itself. I found this very helpful, and then I wind up part of the time buying a used copy of the book for very little so that I can really go through the whole thing. So that it's a discovery process. Now, there was a term earlier about the digital world offering more distractions. There are, I think, levels of distraction. And you were speaking of the lower ones earlier, whoever was doing that. But this is a higher level of distraction, which is very healthy, where you find things in the world that alter your course and enrich it, give you more to interact with other people. And I just wanted to make that point that so the hypertext has taken on that form, and you can have your cake and eat it. You've got the book, and you have the connections.
I'll just comment. Oh, do you want to take
well,
other
let's take a question,
Okay.
but please be brief, and because we are short of time. If you don't mind.
Hi, Kate. The way that I see the newness that you're creating is as follows. To my mind, you're taking students and turning them into digital science fiction writers, creating a future game, and you're taking the study of the humanities and turning it into science fiction. So is this description just wishful thinking on my part, or is my interpretation valid?
Okay, thank you. Olivia? And then we'll have some others. Right here.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed both papers. I have a question each for Jonathan and Kate. For Jonathan, in the evolution of artificial intelligence, this one name really stands out. That is Kenneth Colby, who was also a psychiatrist and who was one of the pioneering people who wrote computer scripts to make computers emulate human psychic conditions, and he invented a machine called the paranoia machine, as you probably know. My question is, since he did this work in the 60s, did this racial discourse get into the computer script, the kind of human-computer modules that he created? So that was, and I wonder if you've encountered similar kinds of assumptions in the early artificial intelligence experiments with computers, and mind as computers and all of that. For Kate, I found that speculation game very gratifying psychologically. But I wanted to know, for that kind of game to work, certainly you have the Angry Bird sort of firing at Goldman Sachs. Does that imply ideological criticism? Where would it take us? Because that kind of action in science fiction would imply a lot about what it means to have an action. In other words, would it inspire the students to think at a deeper level as to exactly what is the structural problem in this world? Would they simply be gratified by this play, and would they go further and take the play to the street? Or what exactly is going to happen with this? Or this is a substitution for action for the revolution?
Please.
Well, to answer the hypertext question first, I think your point is very well taken, and electronic literature has followed a sort of similar trajectory. That is, hypertext electronic literature was the most prevalent form in the early 1990s, and now it's become a much more diversified field of literary endeavor. I wasn't able to tell from the questioner whether she thought the transition from humanities scholar to science fiction writers was a good thing or a bad thing, but I'll just... Oh, okay, all right. But I'll just say that each of the imagined scenarios for the future is crafted to rigorously investigate a particular consequence of following a certain trajectory. And so in a sense, yes, they're creating fictional documents, but all of those documents are only a step sidewards or a step forward from where we are right now. And so it's meant not to just be unconstrained creative writing, but a very focused extrapolation. And then to Lydia's point, the Angry Birds is good, silly fun, but the game as a whole is loaded with so much educational content that we felt in order to keep players gratified, we had to offer them some kind of good, silly fun. But there's a lot of very solid educational content here that's embodied in both the gameplay and the narrative. So our purpose here is both to convey actual information about the financial crisis and where we are and where we might go, but at the same time to do so in a fashion that involves both narrative and gameplay as kind of enticements to engage with the more intellectually challenging material.
I'll just say very briefly, excellent question. Two parts. One, I really don't know, actually. I think it's a terrific question, and I will say that my talk is taken from a much longer talk where I talk about the relationship of the discourse of schizophrenia to different forms of protest politics and other conversations that were happening about schizophrenia in the 1960s. I've had some interaction with the stuff on computers, and the question for me is kind of how it relates to the diagnostic revisions that are happening at the time, and also about the relationship between that rhetoric and another more well-known rhetoric, which was about anti-psychiatry at the time, and this idea that basically there were protests against psychiatry itself, and schizophrenic models for society, and things that Deleuze and Guattari and other people talk about. And I will say about that I went into the project thinking that there was going to be a racial critique of that basically a lot of the anti-psychiatry stuff was coming from a kind of British and American white liberal tradition, but I found these fantastic examples of overlap between the different discourses, and my favorite were a series of conversations that happened in the UK about the dialectics of liberation that brought together Stokely Carmichael with the leaders of anti-psychiatry. And so I should look back at that stuff and see if that material is ever referenced by the other people who were looking at kind of computer reasoning. But I would also say that there's a kind of side irrelevant vignette about this, which is that I did my residency at Stanford Hospital, and the person who was the head of the unit that I was working on at the VA was a real plane enthusiast, and so he got like a $10 million grant from the VA. This is back in the old days when you could actually get grants, and his question was, can people with severe mental illness land planes? And he bought probably the biggest computer simulated airplane landing thing, the thing they train pilots on, because he really wanted to practice. And my strongest memory of residency was watching these people who had no flying experience and were very psychotic, and they would crash the plane every single time. And so I don't think any papers came out of it, but it turns out people with serious mental illness, or me, I couldn't land the plane either. But this guy got a lot of practice. So there is some kind of literature now about this kind of computer models, but that has nothing to do with your question. So.
Any other questions? I have a kind of philosophical question, maybe we can call it that, about the concept of, I mean, the bringing together of making with critique, and also the concept of speculation. It seems to me the moment that critique comes into contact with making, we are no longer simply making, manufacturing, forming, but we're really altering, in a certain kind of mode of, let's say, poetic mode, a certain poesis. We don't just simply form, but we are altering form in some fashion, we're intervening in form. And it seems to me that we can say that, philosophically speaking at least, speculation does the same. I mean, in the realm of thought. Not in economy. Well, I'm getting to that, obviously. But in the realm of thought, speculation is not a negative concept by any means. It's an extremely affirmative concept. It is the mode by which we can think of things that don't exist, things that are bring into form certain things that don't exist. From a certain standpoint, though not practically speaking, because we all lose our money, this is also what is supposed to be happening in the economic sphere. So there is this, and I'm trying to think of this game also from that standpoint as well. I mean, it's obviously you said, and I understand that the important thing here is a learning process. I mean, it's an educational process, a self-learning process, even perhaps in a collective sense. But also it's involved in the same process by which things are altered, and maybe that could be one of its elements. Other people altering things as opposed to the 1% economists who are altering things against us.
Well, we obviously meant for speculation to be a multi-layered, ambiguous term in just the sense that you were outlining. So there's financial speculation, there's speculative fiction, the science fiction element of the game, but then there's speculation in a theoretical sense of interrogating implications and extrapolating consequences. And the fact that it's all embodied in a game is meant to bring these sometimes conflictual meanings together, but also to form what we hope will be a real intervention in the processes of speculation in all of those senses. So if we were to publish a scholarly paper in a small circulation humanities journal, we might reach a couple hundred people perhaps, but we're hoping to get 1,000+ players of this game. And so it's meant also as a public intervention in the public sphere, even by people who may not know they should be interested in this, or maybe you aren't even interested in learning about it, but in the course of playing the game will nevertheless be exposed to these materials.
Or a little similar to Stathis's, and I was sort of, Kathleen, a little confused about this kind of tension in the two games that you outlined. One is your game itself, and then there's the cathedral kind of game. So this idea somehow that you must be able to do something in order to actually internalize what the implications of that thing are. And I'm wondering if that's the only model in a sense of learning, and what this does to other forms of imagination and disidentification. I mean, this is setting up a model that says that unless and until you can actually internalize the entire process of what it would mean to build a cathedral and how you would, fund this and so on and so forth, you actually don't know. There's something that's incomplete about the way that you approach this object or apprehend it. So I'm just wondering about the tension, and then you said something very different in your response to Stathis right now. So I'm wondering about this kind of tension that seems to be embedded in the way that you're thinking about this project.
Between making and critique, you mean specifically?
Between making and critique, but also what the project of this kind of pedagogy, in a sense, is.
Yeah.
Because it seems to assume that, we are actually now embedding ourselves in making itself rather than just reading about it or seeing it or visualizing it, and therefore there's a more intimate and fuller experience of what is entailed, and I wonder about that.
Well, part of what's at stake here, I think, is the position of contemporary academia in a highly mediatized environment where we're the consumers of all kinds of media, and the importance of having humanities students begin to envision themselves as the producers of media. And by producers of media, I don't only mean producing scholarly monographs and books, although that's part of it, but I also mean that they can take an active role in forming media objects, disseminating those media objects, thinking about their research in terms of media objects, and so forth. So let's say that one was committed to print scholarship and one envisioned one's research project solely in terms of print scholarship. So what that means currently is that you would publish in a print journal and your article would not be read in a print journal. It would be read online through JSTOR for 99% of the people who are going to access your article. So what does that mean about how you would envision your article knowing it's going to be read online? So presently, the aggregators of journal articles like JSTOR require PDF as the format for journals to use to get into their archive, but PDF itself is changing so that it can include not just media objects, but things like three-dimensional SketchUps and so forth. And so the purview of what is possible to do in what we think of as print scholarship is on the verge of radical transformation. And so even if one is only committed to print scholarship, the opportunities for creativity and reimagining are, if not already there, on the horizon of being there. And to do that, to take advantage of those opportunities, requires a kind of shift of perspective where one ceases to think of one's job as writing the words and then turning it over to a print publisher to format it, decide on typeface, disseminate it, and so forth, to where you now begin to envision yourself as an active producer, not only of crafting the words, but of how and in what form and in what manner those are going to be published and disseminated as well.
Great, thank you. And the last question, because of reasons I mentioned, yes.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a question. I was reminded, listening to you, of a talk that was given at my university, Johns Hopkins, at some kind of inaugural symposium of a new Center for Advanced Media Studies. And it was a talk by your colleague, Tim Lenoir. And it was also, the subject was also alternative reality games. And he was asked, or he recounted a story that the challenge for him really became, could one make an alternative reality game that was also fun? But the question I think that he was asked in particular was, why is it that most of these alternative reality game narratives work with some kind of dystopian scenario? And that brings me almost back to the question that I asked this morning to Rosie, namely, is it only when we can imagine that we would somehow have been written out of the equation, we would have vanished, we would have seen the vanishing of the human as we know it, or think we know it, that somehow the impetus to learn and a new way of acquiring knowledge is possible. And similarly, in a related question, I forget the name of the author who wrote the book Reality is Broken, which is also a book about alternative reality games which have become already the reality and much better than the reality. And it seemed to me that in your account, in a very interesting manner, much emphasis was put on references to realities or bringing in examples from reality, almost to the point where it would seem that the alternative reality game is a pedagogical tool, a vehicle, much more than, say, imagining an alternative mode of relating to reality altogether. And I was just wondering whether you could comment on that, or...
Well, it's probably no accident that Tim and I are thinking along similar lines because we're co-directors of the Greater Than Games labs and work closely together. So we're sort of on the same page in that sense. I think your suggestion that the prospect of imminent catastrophe is a great stimulus to creative thought is a really interesting observation. And perhaps that's why this dystopian future seems to be such an important element in alternate reality games. Although Jane McGonigal, who wrote the book Reality is Broken, also has other sorts of alternate reality games like Super Better, which are aimed to improve mental health and for someone battling some kind of serious illness and so forth. But someone quoted earlier, I guess it was Srinivas, Fred Jameson's comment that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And I guess the question that this game is trying to pose is, can we at least imagine the end of predatory capitalism?
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.